Boromir looked at Heather and spoke gravely. Let that be a grand lesson. No matter how great you think you are, there is always someone or something greater still. Once back with their horses, Maris and Aleph attached the 3 Shurkite arrowheads to 3 shafts, 2 for her, 1 for him. At first, she was unhappy with the implications of being the one with 2 arrows, but Aleph convinced her that despite one of them being required to carry 2, dragons often considered females to be of little threat. That should give her a chance to put the arrows to good use. The 2 spent time wondering where to find Vorta and what was the best way of fighting him. Remembering the surroundings he had seen in his vision of the wizard battling Vorta, added to what Vera told him about Toran, Aleph suggested searching the Red Mountains and the Peak of Toran. Why the Peak of Toran? She asked. It seems reasonable, but is there a specific reason? Aleph sighed. The witch woman, Vera, told me the peak may be important. The elf stared at him. Vera? The old hag on the border of the swamp? That Vera? Aye. You were either extremely lucky or not very appealing to have survived a meeting with that evil hag and her twin sister. Twin sister? He asked in shock. I saw no sister, only Vera. Maris nodded. That doesn't surprise me. Her twin, Alna, I think, is cursed. I heard she must eat raw meat or blood, so she hunts in the swamp for unlucky travelers. Vera herself often makes a meal of travelers, too. Aye, she tried with me, getting a belly full of steel instead. He was silent for a moment. Mayhap that was her sister a few days later in the form of a Loluth. It was one of the 2, anyway. How is it that you know of her? I was wondering how it was that you did not. Most people around the west side of the swamp know about her. I'm sure it was someone from the surrounding villages who told you. He nodded. So you went to her for information, killed her, and met her cursed sister in the swamp. You killed her too, I take it. He nodded again. She jumped upon me and I had no choice. At the time, I knew not what the creature was. Not that it would have mattered. Well, no loss for either. She mounted her horse. Still, you should count yourself lucky to survive a meeting with her. Aleph smiled inwardly, looking up as he said to himself, I do. Maris caught his eye before he mounted his horse and rode off. His words were not low enough for her to miss them, and she also caught the tone he used. A warm feeling went through her heart as she watched the broad-shouldered man riding ahead of her. She admitted he was growing on her, and she did not mind at all. They rode toward the mountains for several days. Though they rode through the wilds most of the time, they also used what would have been considered well-traveled roads. Such was the threat of Vorta, however, that they had not met another human soul on the roads. Their journey brought evidence of the reason for the empty routes. The many signs of burned homes and pastures, slaughtered herds of sheep, goats, and cattle, blackened forest, and scorched swampland accompanied their passage. On rare occasions they rode past the remains of a burned wagon and the charred bodies of its owners. Each night they made camp and engaged in small talk while stealing glances at each other. The nights always ended with them bidding each other an uneasy good night, secretly wishing that one would decide not to spend the night alone. Despite such thoughts, their joint wishes went unfulfilled, and their 2 bedrolls never became one. On the 18th day, they reached the bottom of the Grand Mount, the largest of the Red Mountains, and home of the Peak of Toran. Are you sure about the arrows, Aleph? Maris asked, looking upward. The red rock face stretched up until it disappeared into the clouds. Aleph nodded easily. Aye, lass, I've seen them used before. Even with a mediocre bow, one of these can pierce 5 suits of plate armor, and everything in betwixt. They will go through Dragonhide right enough, straight into his dark heart. Just the same, she said, rubbing her fingertips against her thumb, I had best prepare some spells. Just don't use your lightning spell, he said softly, dismounting. Maris looked at him. He spoke of things which he should not have any knowledge of. "Why not?" she asked, somewhat irate. "I can understand not using fire-based spells. They would have no effect on the Red Dragon, or so little as to be useless. If we encounter Vorta in his lair, there is bound to be a great deal of gold and silver. Such elements have a quick hunger for heat and energy in your lightning. Unless you are touching the dragon, your spell will turn toward the metals and disperse." "How do you know that?" She vaulted from her horse to stand beside him. The answer made sense, but she wanted to know how he understood such things. Aleph looked up at the mist-covered peak, not wanting to mention his vision in the Mirror Lake. "I have had my dealings with dragons before." Humph. She looked up too, frowning. "Climbing would take time and effort. The dragon could easily pick us off the mountainside as we climb. There doesn't seem to be much room for drawing bow and arrow." He looked up and nodded. "In that case, you can use your lightning bolt, and I'll buy you 2 ales." She smiled. "Don't think I won't take you up on that promise." Then she murmured softly, "Or any others." His head turned sharply, but she was looking away, which meant she had not meant him to hear that. He remembered the brief moments in the cavern. His feelings for her had grown steadily since. Soon he must gamble and tell her how he felt, hoping she too felt the same. But that would come later. First, the dragon. Then, well, then there would be time for other things. Once their horses were secured, they slowly began climbing. It took most of a day until they reached the cavern Granth found days earlier. Aleph and Maris sat to catch their breaths. Maris looked down at the greens and browns of the surrounding land. In the distance, she saw light sparkle from the waters of the great swamp. To the south was the winding Blood River, as red as the rock on which she sat. "It's beautiful up here." Aleph glanced around, then looked at her. "Yes, it is," he said sincerely. Maris, returning his gaze, knew what he meant. A slight blush came to her cheeks. She looked away, not trusting herself to say anything. Instead, she studied the Bowden-laden cavern yawning behind them, easily identifying the remains of horses, cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and humans. There were also pieces of armor. She recognized the jawbone of either a young giant or a half-giant, a few orc bones, and what looked like one of the reptilian Dagon warriors. There were countless others she could not identify. Aleph also studied the bone pile. "I would say that Vorta or another dragon lives here." His voice shook her from her thoughts. "So it would seem. Are you sure you want to go in?" "I have no choice. The dragon has spilled too much innocent blood. If we don't stop him, no one will be safe. See that armor? I know some of the houses from whence it came. If this beast was able to level even Duke Herod's castle, where can anyone hide in safety?" Maris nodded and took out her bow. After knocking a Shurkite arrow each, they entered the dark passageways, brimstone air. They walked silently down a rock-strewn tunnel and quickly reached the treasure-filled cavern. Unlike Granth, they immediately faced Vorta as they came into the open with bows half raised. "More meat that talks to fill my belly." Vorta watched them carefully. "No, dragon," Aleph said loudly, stepping away from Maris. "We are not here to fill your belly." Vorta snorted a puff of smoke and cocked his head sideways. "Then you come to try to kill Vorta. You not be first." Aleph shook his head and slowly lowered his bow. "I don't want to kill you unless we have to. I would prefer we talk and make a deal with you." Maris glanced at him as if he was mad, but said nothing. Aleph's gaze was steady on the dragon. His bow was still lowered, but he gave a slight hand signal for her to stop moving, while he kept walking slowly to the left. "Deal?" Vorta asked. "But what you have that Vorta not?" "You have a great treasure, I know of a greater one, so great that your lair is pale in comparison. Meat that talks give riddle, the dragon said impatiently. Where this treasure? Aleph shook his head. First, we talk. Are you willing to stop your attacks in exchange for the treasure? Vorta's eyes narrowed. Tell me where treasure? I tell you answer. Aleph looked at Marist, who was 4 feet from his right. He cocked his head sideways very slightly. Seeing she understood, he continued the discussion. Great Vorta, the treasure of which I speak is quite large, and it is far more valuable than all the treasure you have here. He walked farther to the left, while Marist slowly crept around to the right, past various boulders. The finest of jewels paled beside it. The dragon's greed increased. Yet as large as this treasure is, few could hope to find it, much less possess it. In fact, as powerful as you are, I doubt you could ever obtain it. The tale was working. Vorta lost interest in the elf, who made a stealthy path to the dragon's flank. Where this treasure? He demanded, his deadly jaws moving a few feet from Aleph's head. The yellow eyes narrowed slightly as Vorta focused on the human. Between rows of sharp teeth, he said, Tell Vorta now. Will you stop your attacks? He spoke calmly, despite the hot, fetid breath enveloping him. The large-scaled head came within a foot of Aleph, and the eyes narrowed farther. Vorta do what Vorta want. Tell me where treasure or burn. Aleph stood his ground, staring back into the large yellow eyes, ignoring the shreds of burnt cloth clinging to some of the dragon's teeth. In a calm, cold, emotionless voice, he said, Kill me, and you learn nothing. Vorta raised his head and roared angrily in response. Marist took her chance, drawing back and aiming. The green-tipped arrow cut through the air, but she fired too soon. Instead of burying itself in the dragon's red chest, it sliced a line across the scaled hide just before the forelegs, peeling off scales and flesh before burying itself in the cavern wall. A dark red streak of blood and raw flesh showed in its wake, but the wound was far from being fatal to the dragon. Vorta thundered in anger and pain, tumbling rock from the cavern roof. He stopped suddenly and glanced at the elf with blind hatred as she prepared to fire her second arrow. Instead of using his fiery breath, he sent a huge claw forward, grabbing her waist and pulling her near his gaping mouth and white teeth. Her bow and last arrow dropped to the cavern floor with a clatter. Stop, Vorta! Aleph shouted, rushing forward as Marist gasped in pain. No meat that talks tell Vorta what to do. Now tell where treasure, or Vorta eat this meat that causes pain. I'll tell you if you let her go, he said desperately. Vorta not trust meat. Tell now. He squeezed harder, making Marist gasp in pain and struggle vainly against the dragon's claws. With her arms pinned against her sides, she could not cast any magic spells. Aleph took a deep breath. You have the greatest treasure I have ever known in your grasp right now. Vorta did not reply immediately, as the information slowly sank into his reptilian mind. Although he was not as intelligent as a human, he understood the words, though their meaning confused him. Where treasure? He turned Marist in his grasp. A sharp talon tugged at the opening of her bodice. Vorta explored her body and clothing, looking for concealed riches. She has treasure hidden? It's not hidden to those with eyes to see. His voice caught for a second. It's her heart that is the treasure of which I speak. Heart! Vorta was even more puzzled. He focused greedy eyes on the bare flesh around her nearly exposed breast. How heart treasure? Aleph smiled grimly. I will show you. He pulled back his long bow, raised it, and fired in one swift motion. The green point buried itself deep into the center of Vorta's chest. Only the fletchings showed between two red belly scales. Vorta raised his head in a bellow of pain that dwarfed the loudest of thunderclaps. Maris dropped to the floor as the dragon moved his claw to the wound, trying vainly to pull out the embedded arrow. He rolled along the rock floor as more stone fell from the ceiling. "Get away!" Alf shouted, seeing steam shoot from the dragon's raised head. "Get out while you can!" "What about you?" she shouted back over the echoes of the dragon's death roar. He knew what was about to happen, but it would not matter as long as Maris was safe. "Don't worry about me, just get out." He cast aside his bow in favor of sword and shield. Vorta cut any further replies short. His head came down to spit fire at Aleph, who raised his shield, held the sword at ready. His defense was of little help. The shield flew from his grasp, becoming a puddle of molten iron on the floor. His shining sword suffered the same fate. The blast knocked him several feet against a rock wall. "Meat that talks hurt, Vorta. Now Vorta make meat hurt. Hurt bad. Hurt slow." Aleph painfully stood against the wall, knowing Vorta would torture him. The first blast could have killed him if Vorta had wished. Steam rose from its nostrils as another blast of fire prepared, but red froth came with it. Aleph looked around for some defense or hiding place and found none. He scanned the cavern to see if Maris was safe. Feeling a measure of relief when he did not see her, he sighed. He did not care if he died as long as she was safe. He had only one regret, that the dragon survived his attack. Aleph took some comfort in knowing that it would prove fatal in time. The red froth showed that the arrow had pierced a lung. His quest was as complete as possible, and his children had been avenged to the best of his ability. The red-scaled head lowered again, white teeth shining dark maroon from the dragon's blood. Steam flowed like a river of smoke from the great jaws, and Aleph knew that would soon be followed by fire. A breath of flame was ready to burst forward when suddenly Vorta froze in a sudden, spastic motion as if paralyzed in pain. The mouth quivered, followed by the rest of the body. The great wings spread outward and stiffened as blue ropes of lightning danced inside the gaping mouth. Spider webs of energy danced along the scale hide as Vorta's muscles shuddered. As quickly as it began, the crackle of electricity vanished. Vorta dropped heavily to the ground, his muscles still quivering under his scaly hide. Aleph stood motionless, not comprehending what had happened. Streams of smoke carried the stench of seared flesh from the dead dragon's mouth and nose, forming a dense gray haze above and around the fallen body like a death cloud. He stared, thinking it was a dream brought on by his impending death. Then he looked beyond the dragon's still body as a dark shape stirred within the smoke. As he watched, it became more defined, walking toward him in the white haze. It was human-shaped and became more distinct until it cleared the smoke and became a female elf with a broad smile. "So, how do you like your dragon?" Maris asked politely, kicking the scaled hide beside her. "Rare or well done?" Aleph smiled and sighed. Leaning against a rock wall, he took a deep, though painful breath to calm himself before asking, "How did you do that?" Her smile changed to a mischievous smirk as she rubbed her fingertips against her thumb. "I can't tell you all my secrets, can I?" He smiled, though it was pain, as his body began to register the impact he took against the rock. Shaking his head slightly at her arrogant humor, he said, "No, lass, I guess not." He looked at the still smoldering dragon. "Now that he's dead, there's not much left to do." Maris raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She walked to him and gently led him by the arm, ignoring his natural male reluctance to accept help. She held him close to help support some of his weight and led him down the tunnel from which they came. Finally, she shrugged. "I don't know about there not being anything left for you to do. We still have some unfinished business." He took slow, painful steps and gave her a puzzled look. Once outside, she eased him onto a boulder and checked his wounds. Seems like your old bones didn't take too much of a beating, though I imagine you'll be sore for a while. The sly smile appeared. Hopefully you aren't too sore for what I have in mind for you. He tilted his head slightly, still not understanding fully what Maris was getting at. I have no need for anything in that cavern. Seeing Vortod dead was all I wanted, but I thought you wanted to kill him for fame and fortune. You have that now, I'd say. He nodded at the treasure cave. And more. She frowned as she realized he had not understood her hints. It's the more that I'm interested in right now. Fame won't feed you. And as far as treasure or wealth goes, well, I think I found something more worthwhile. She smiled and stopped to look in his dark eyes. The pain on his face eased as she spoke. In fact, I believe you said the same thing just a few moments ago. He smiled back and gently brushed a strand of dark hair from her cheek. Yes, I did, didn't I? He took her hands and pressed her palms against his chest. The heart that beats beneath your hands shall do so only for as long as you wish it, and for you only. She blushed at the sincerity in his voice, knowing he meant it. She brought his hands to her chest and said softly, My heart belongs to you, Aleph, for now and always. They stared into each other's eyes for a moment as the sky flashed ruby red from the setting sun, striking the distant crystal mountains. I was going to tell you how I felt, he admitted, once this was over, and She placed 2 fingers against his lip to silence him. Just compare me to the richest of treasures again, she said softly. Better yet, just kiss me. Sitting together with the land of Norval stretched out below them and the red skies above, they surrendered to their passions and kissed.